A millionaire CEO walked out of the hospital only to find a 7-year-old girl behind the wheel of a car. The reason left him speechless. Alexander Carter wasn't used to walking alone. Usually someone trailed behind him, a security guard, a personal assistant, a hospital administrator eager to please. But on that particular morning, just minutes after being released from a minor surgical procedure in the private wing of one of the city's most prestigious hospitals, he insisted on walking to the car by himself. He had a headache, a dull fog behind his eyes, and the sterile fluorescent lights inside had only made it worse. The air outside was cold and crisp, and for the first time in a week, he could breathe. The sky hung heavy with clouds, and the city buzzed faintly in the distance, muffled by the hospital's thick walls and gated grounds. As he made his way across the parking lot, adjusting the cuff of his light blue suit jacket, he spotted something strange, not just unusual, something that stopped him cold. At first, it was nothing more than the outline of a car tucked between two ambulances in a far corner of the lot. It was a black Honda, rust around the wheel wells, the hood slightly dented. The kind of car that looked like it had more stories than miles left to give. The engine was off, no hazard lights, no movement, but something drew his attention to the driver's side window. He paused, squinting. There, barely reaching above the wheel, sat a child. He walked toward the car cautiously, not wanting to startle her. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her blonde hair was tied into 2 uneven ponytails, and her skin was pale against the worn denim jacket that swallowed her small frame. Underneath, she wore a pink dress, slightly wrinkled, as if she had put it on in a hurry. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared toward the hospital entrance with a kind of silent desperation he'd seen only in people who had already been told no too many times. He knelt beside the driver's window and gently tapped on the glass. The girl jumped, startled, but she didn't scream. She rolled down the window slowly, her expression uncertain. "Are you here with someone?" he asked softly, his voice stripped of its usual executive edge. She nodded. "My mom," she said, barely above a whisper. "She's sick. Really sick." Alexander's breath caught. "Where is she now?" "Inside, but they didn't help. She came out, then she fell asleep. She's not waking up." It was like being doused in cold water. He rose to his feet in an instant. "Stay right here," he told her, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be right back." He didn't walk. He ran through the automatic doors, past the waiting room, past confused nurses and security staff calling his name. He didn't stop until he reached the front desk, slamming his hand against the counter. "There's a woman out there," he said, pointing. "She's unconscious. She needs help now." The nurse behind the desk blinked, startled by the intensity in his voice. "She came in earlier," she said cautiously, checking something on her screen. "No insurance. She left before she was registered." She's dying," he snapped. "Get someone outside now." Perhaps it was the fury in his voice, or perhaps it was the recognition in the eyes of the young intern who suddenly realized who he was. Alexander Carter, CEO of the very system they were employed under. Whatever it was, things moved quickly after that. A trauma team was dispatched. A gurney rolled across the parking lot. The girl, still sitting behind the wheel, watched silently as her mother, pale, lifeless, blood soaking the back of her skirt, was lifted from the passenger seat. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared frozen as her entire world was rolled through those sliding doors. Only after the commotion died down after the mother had disappeared down the hallway and the staff began to murmur and whisper behind clipboards, did Alexander return to the car. The little girl was still there, still clutching the steering wheel. He opened the door slowly. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said. "I'm Alexander." He crouched down beside her again. "You did something incredibly brave today, Sophie." She blinked up at him, lips trembling. "They said they wouldn't come. They told us to call again, but I didn't know what else to do. So I just drove." "You drove here?" he asked, stunned. She nodded. I watched how Mommy drives. I remembered the turns. 7 miles, a 7-year-old girl had driven 7 me in a broken-down car to save her mother's life because no one else would. Because no ambulance came. Because the system he helped build had decided that without insurance, help was optional. Alexander didn't say anything else. He simply reached out and took her small hand in his. And as the sky darkened and the sirens faded inside the hospital walls, one thing became painfully clear. His life was never going to be the same again. Sophie sat in the hospital's family waiting room, her legs swinging off the edge of a hard plastic chair, too tall for her feet to reach the floor. The walls were beige and cold, lined with faded posters about hand-washing and flu season. A loud TV played an old cartoon. Its colors dimmed, the sound turned down low. No one seemed to notice her sitting there. Nurses passed by without stopping. Volunteers handed coffee to tired adults, but glanced over her like she was invisible. She had been offered a juice box earlier by a nurse who didn't know what else to do, but it sat unopened in her lap. Her small hands trembled, and her lips were dry, but she didn't cry. She was afraid that if she cried, she would lose control completely, and there would be no one left to pick up the pieces. Alexander stood a few feet away, speaking with the head of emergency services in a low, tense voice. The doctor, an older woman with short silver hair and the calm of someone used to life or death decisions, was explaining the situation. Emily, Sophie's mother, had lost a dangerous amount of blood. She had suffered a ruptured ectopic pregnancy that had gone undiagnosed for days, possibly weeks. She was lucky to be alive. If Sophie hadn't brought her in when she did, the doctor said plainly, she would have been dead by morning. He looked over at the little girl sitting alone. Her dress was wrinkled and stained, the denim jacket too thin for the chill in the waiting room. Her hair had fallen out of its makeshift ponytails. Her shoes, cheap canvas flats, had holes in the soles. She looked like a child who had learned too early how to disappear, how to shrink herself to avoid being a burden. But there she was, having done something no child should have had to do. She didn't need sympathy. She needed someone to show up for her. For real. Consistently. Not with pity. With presence. Alexander thanked the doctor and approached Sophie slowly. He knelt beside her chair again, just like he had in the parking lot. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging him, but not saying anything. He didn't push her. They're doing everything they can for your mom, he said gently. She's a fighter. So are you. Sophie nodded once. Is she going to die? She asked her voice. No, he said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it. She looked at him for the first time then. Really looked. Her blue eyes met his, and in them he saw a storm of emotions she didn't yet know how to name. Fear, exhaustion, guilt, hope. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small wrapped granola bar. She stared at it for a moment, then took it without a word. I don't want to go back home, she whispered after a moment. It's dark and cold and it smells funny. He nodded. You don't have to think about that right now. Let's just focus on today, okay? Another nurse walked by, eyeing them both with confusion. Alexander realized how strange this must look. A powerful man in a tailored suit sitting cross-legged on a waiting room floor next to a little girl who didn't belong to him. But he didn't care. He hadn't cared since the moment he saw her behind the wheel of that car. A social worker arrived an hour later. She had a clipboard, polite eyes, and a cautious smile. Her name was Michelle. She knelt beside Sophie, introducing herself softly. But Sophie immediately leaned closer to Alexander. He instinctively placed a hand on her back. Michelle explained that since Emily was unconscious and Sophie had no immediate family to call, the girl would need to be placed in temporary custody just for the night until things were sorted out. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Alexander's jaw clenched. She's not going anywhere but with me, he said quietly but firmly. Michelle raised her eyebrows. You're not listed as family. No, I'm not, he agreed. But I'm the only person in this building who knows what this girl has done today. And I'll be damned if she ends this night in some cold government facility after saving her mother's life. Michelle hesitated. She looked from Sophie to Alexander and back again. There are rules, she said. Then bend them, he replied. I'll sign whatever forms you need. You want guarantees, background checks. My legal team will send everything before midnight, but she's not going into the system. Not tonight. Sophie clung to his arm. The social worker saw it. Felt it. After a long pause, she finally nodded. An hour later, after a whirlwind of paperwork, calls, and legal exceptions made possible only by the kind of influence most people couldn't imagine having, Sophie was buckled into the back seat of Alexander's car. She stared out the window as the city passed by, lights blurring against the glass. Her head leaned against the door, eyes half closed. Her body swayed with every turn, but she didn't speak. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't care. All that mattered was that she wasn't alone. When they arrived at his building, the doorman nearly dropped his phone at the sight of Alexander walking in with a child. Elevators opened it into his penthouse, and the girl's expression shifted for the first time since the hospital. She didn't smile, but she looked around in awe. The ceilings were high. The lights were soft and warm. The city glittered below like a galaxy at her feet. You live here? She asked quietly. He nodded. For now. Tonight, this is your home too. She followed him inside, leaving her old shoes by the door. He showed her the guest room and used until now. The bed was too big, the sheets too crisp, the air too clean. But she didn't complain. She climbed up onto the mattress and hugged her knees to her chest. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered almost to herself. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed. You found the right place. And as he closed the door behind him later that night, leaving a nightlight glowing gently by her side, he realized he wasn't the rescuer in this story. She had rescued herself, and now he had to be worthy of the fact that she had let him be part of her second chance. The following morning, Alexander awoke earlier than usual. He was used to waking up to silence to a carefully programmed morning routine designed to maximize productivity. Black coffee brewed automatically. Financial news murmuring from the flat screen in his kitchen. Calendar alerts stacked by the minute. But today was different. As he sat on the edge of his bed in a pair of gray sweatpants and a t-shirt he hadn't worn in years, he listened not for news but for small sounds. Footsteps, breathing, movement, anything to tell him. Sophie had slept through the night. He walked quietly down the hallway toward the guest room, where the door was still slightly ajar. Inside, the early morning light had just begun to spill across the floor in soft golden strips. Sophie lay curled up on top of the blanket, still wearing the same pink dress and denim jacket from the day before. Her shoes were off, tucked neatly beside the bed. She had one arm wrapped around a pillow and the other curled beneath her chin. Her features tense even in sleep. There was a crease between her eyebrows, a sign that rest didn't come easily. He didn't wake her. Instead, he made his way to the kitchen and did something he hadn't done in years. He cooked. It was nothing fancy. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. But it was real. He didn't call for a chef. He didn't ask his housekeeper to return early. He just stood there awkwardly flipping eggs in a pan, uncertain of the right portion size for a 7-year-old girl who'd had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders for far too long. When Sophie finally wandered into the kitchen, she looked smaller than he remembered from the night before. She was barefoot, hair messy, eyes still swollen from sleep. She paused at the edge of the marble countertop like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come any closer. Hey, Alexander said gently. You hungry? She shrugged and climbed up onto one of the tall stools at the kitchen island. Her feet dangled, swinging slowly. He placed a plate in front of her and slid the juice glass next to it. She stared at the food for a long moment before picking up the fork. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. He knew from the way she slowly started eating that this wasn't just about hunger. It was about trust. Between bites, she finally asked, "Is my mom still alive?" He set down his coffee cup, startled by the quiet directness in her voice. "Yes," he said firmly. She's still in the hospital and she's getting the care she needs now. They're watching her closely. The doctor said she's stable this morning." "Do they know I drove her?" she asked. "They do," he answered. "And they're not mad." "No one is mad. They're amazed." Honestly, Sophie nodded and kept eating. There was no pride in her face, no recognition of her own heroism, just a heavy acceptance. Like she'd done what she had to do and that was all there was to it. After breakfast, Alexander gave her a quick tour of the penthouse. She stayed close to him, asking quiet questions about things he never expected to explain. Why there were 2 sinks in his bathroom, what the little black circle on the wall did. It was a speaker, and if his bed always looked that clean. He showed her the library, a cozy space with floor-to-ceiling shelves, and 2 leather chairs facing a wide window. Her eyes lit up when she saw the books. She ran her fingers over the spines, stopping every few steps to tilt her head and read the titles. "You can read anything you want," he told her. "Or we can go get more, whatever you like." She pulled out a children's book he didn't even know he had, something left behind by a long-forgotten visitor, and carried it over to the window seat. She curled up there, opening the pages slowly, like the book might fall apart if handled too roughly. Alexander watched her for a while, and then sat nearby with his laptop pretending to work. But he wasn't reading emails. He was thinking about the night before, about the way her hand had gripped his coat, about the way she hadn't once asked for anything, not even when she had every right to. Around noon, he took her back to the hospital. Emily was still unconscious, but improving. A nurse led Sophie into the room, and Alexander watched from the hallway as the little girl climbed onto a chair beside the bed, resting her small hand on her mother's arm. The room was quiet, filled with machines and soft beeps. She sat there for nearly an hour without speaking. When she came back out, she didn't say much, but Alexander could tell the visit had steadied her. On the drive home, Sophie asked softly, "Are we going back to your place now?" He nodded. "Only if you want to." She looked out the window for a long time, then whispered, "Can I sleep in clean clothes tonight?" He pulled the car into a parking lot and took her shopping. They didn't go to a luxury boutique. They went to a small local store where she could choose what she liked. She picked out pajamas with tiny stars, 2 pairs of leggings, a sweater with a cat on it, and a new pair of sneakers that lit up when she walked. When they got home, she changed and walked barefoot across the living room floor, her arms out like airplane wings. She twirled once, twice, and then flopped onto the couch with a laugh so light it startled him. That night, Alexander stood outside her room again after she had fallen asleep. The air was warm and quiet. His apartment no longer felt like a monument to solitude. For the first time in years, it felt like it belonged to something more than success. It belonged to a moment, to a shift, to the beginning of a story he hadn't planned, but couldn't imagine ending. 2 days passed, and Alexander found himself doing things he had never imagined. Calling elementary schools, reading bedtime stories, folding tiny laundry. His world, once filled with numbers, negotiations, and meticulously managed time, had taken on a strange new rhythm. Sophie was still quiet, but she was opening up little by little. She asked questions at breakfast, laughed at his attempts to braid her hair, and insisted on feeding the koi fish in the courtyard of his building each afternoon. Every moment with her felt like a glimpse into something pure and unfiltered, a small bright rebellion against the cold structure of his former life. But despite the light that Sophie brought into his home, there was something heavy that lingered around both of them, Emily's condition. She remained unconscious, her body stable but unresponsive. The doctor said she was holding on, but no one could promise anything. Alexander visited her every evening after work, always bringing Sophie along. The nurses knew them by name now. Sophie would sit beside her mother's bed and talk in a soft, steady voice about her day, her new room, the books they read, the weird way Alex cooked scrambled eggs. Alexander always waited in the hallway, never pressing himself into those moments, but always within reach in case she needed him. One evening, as he stood near the vending machines, pretending to care about a cup of hospital coffee, a doctor approached. She was middle-aged, sharp-eyed, and wore a badge that read, Dr. Linda Rohr, Internal Medicine. She recognized Alexander immediately, not just as the CEO of a major healthcare company, but as the man who had raised his voice in that very hallway when Sophie first arrived. Mr. Carter, she began adjusting her glasses. I think we need to talk. He followed her into her office, bracing for the worst. She didn't sugarcoat it. Emily's condition isn't improving. We've avoided saying it because you've given us every resource we could ask for, and I mean that sincerely. But there's something neurological going on. We need to do deeper scans, possibly surgery. She's not out of danger. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. Do what you have to do. Just keep her alive. Dr. Rohr hesitated, then lowered her voice. You know, the irony is this situation could have been prevented if someone had listened earlier, if she'd been seen as more than just her insurance status. She was bleeding for hours before she came here. That child, your child, I suppose she's not mine, he said quietly. But yes, she is now. The doctor gave him a long look, something between respect and sadness. Well, that girl saved her mother's life and maybe yours too. Alexander didn't respond. He couldn't. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen island long after Sophie had gone to bed, sipping tea he didn't want, staring at the city through the glass walls of his penthouse. He thought about the choices he'd made over the years, the policies, the decisions in boardrooms, the people he'd never seen, the invisible ones, the ones like Emily, whose names were reduced to files, whose cries for help were filtered through automated systems designed to optimize time, cost, and liability. He thought about how many people his company had failed. He didn't feel guilt in the shallow, fleeting way that people sometimes do when they write a check or post a statement. He felt something deeper, raw, an obligation not to erase what had happened, but to face it head-on and make it right. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with his executive board. Half of them were confused. The other half were irritated. No one expected what came next. He walked into the conference room, not in a three-piece suit, not with a legal team, not flanked by assistants. He stood alone, sleeves rolled up, holding a photograph in one hand. It was a printed still from a security camera. Sophie sitting in the driver's seat of that old black Honda, staring out toward the ER doors, her face pale, terrified, determined. This, he said, placing the photo on the table in front of them, is what our system missed. He told them everything, not the sanitized version, not the version his PR team had begged him to approve. The truth. He told them about Emily, about Sophie, about how every second they'd been delayed had brought a woman closer to death and forced a child into a role no child should ever be forced to play. He told them how proud he had once been of their numbers, their reputation, their so-called innovation, and how ashamed he now was of the culture they had built beneath it. The room was silent. I'm not asking for a vote, he said finally. I'm telling you what we're doing. Starting today, no patient gets turned away because of insurance. I don't care what it costs. We'll build a fund. I'll personally match it, and I want our name off every billboard until we earn the right to be trusted again. There was pushback, legal concerns, financial alarms, but Alexander didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he felt completely certain about something. Later that afternoon, he picked Sophie up from school. She'd started attending a local private academy with small class sizes and kind teachers. She ran out of the building with her backpack bouncing and her hair in a messy ponytail. She climbed into the car and buckled herself in with practiced ease. Did anything good happen today? He asked as he pulled out of the lot. She nodded. I read out loud in front of the class and I didn't mess up the big words. That's amazing, he said, smiling. She looked at him for a moment, then asked, Did anything good happen to you? He paused, thought about it, then nodded. Yeah, he said. I told the truth, and it felt like the start of something better. She seemed to accept that. She turned toward the window and watched the city drift by. And he realized she had no idea how much she had changed him. Not just his home, Not just his company, but his soul. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Carter didn't measure that change in dollars. He measured it in hope. Emily Carter opened her eyes 5 days later. There was no warning, no dramatic gasp. Just a slow fluttering of her lashes as the fluorescent lights of the hospital ceiling came into focus. Her mouth was dry, her body ached, and a low beeping rhythm echoed in her ears from the machines beside her. She didn't know where she was at first. Her memory came back in fragments. Pain in her side, blood on the floor, Sophie's frightened face, and then nothing. Panic set in almost immediately. Her first thought was Sophie. Was she safe? Had someone helped her? Had she managed to drive all the way? She tried to sit up, but a nurse was already by her side, gently pressing her shoulder down. "You're okay," the woman said softly. "You're in the hospital. You've been very sick, but you're stable now. Your daughter is safe. She's been here every day." Emily couldn't form words yet, but tears spilled from the corners of her eyes. Relief, exhaustion, fear. All of it rolled into one quiet stream down her cheeks. Her baby was safe. Later that afternoon, Sophie was allowed to visit. She entered the room cautiously, her arms wrapped tightly around a small notebook she had been carrying with her all week. When she saw her mother awake, her eyes widened, and her lower lip trembled. She approached slowly, unsure whether she could hug her or if she would hurt her. Emily opened her arms without hesitation. The hug wasn't tight. Her body was still too weak for that, but it was long. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was thick with everything that had gone unsaid. Apologies, promises, pure aching love. Sophie finally pulled back and handed over the notebook. "I wrote down everything," she said, "in case you didn't wake up." Emily opened it and saw pages filled with shaky handwriting. Descriptions of the hospital room. The nurses' names, how many jelly packets they brought with toast each morning. The names of books she read in the waiting room, and little drawings of koi fish, pancakes, and Alexander. Her daughter had tried to preserve the days in case they were lost forever. Emily looked around the room, confused. Where have you been staying?" she asked. Her voice was weak, but she managed to speak clearly. "With Mr. Alex." Sophie replied as if that answered everything. "He brought me here, he picked me up. He didn't let them take me away." Emily blinked. "Who is Mr. Alex?" Before Sophie could explain, the door opened and Alexander stepped inside holding a paper bag with food and a bouquet of sunflowers. He looked different in the daylight than he had on TV or in the magazines Emily used to glance through during breaks at the diner. He looked human, tired maybe, but warm and grounded in a way she didn't expect from a man who could buy buildings with a phone call. "Good to see you awake," he said, walking over to place the flowers on the table. "I figured the room could use something bright." Emily looked from him to Sophie, then back to him again. "You've been helping." Alexander didn't smile, didn't deflect, trying, he said. "But your daughter didn't need much help. She did all the hard stuff." Emily swallowed. "Why?" He sat down in the chair beside her bed, his expression honest and without pity, because the people who should have helped you didn't. "Because I was one of them. Because she reminded me what it feels like to be invisible." She nodded slowly. She wasn't the kind of woman who trusted easily. Life had taught her that kindness usually came with strings. But this man didn't ask for anything. He didn't make himself the center of the story. He just showed up and stayed. In the days that followed, Emily's health continued to improve. Sophie returned to her school routine. But each afternoon, Alexander picked her up personally. He canceled meetings, delayed flights, and rerouted entire schedules just to be there at 3:00 when the school doors opened and she came running out. It became the new rhythm of his life. Coffee in the morning, work until noon, hospital visit, school pickup, homework help, dinner together, and late-night moments staring out the window, wondering how he ever thought his life was full before this. Emily moved into a rehabilitation apartment arranged by the hospital, fully paid for and furnished with care. Alexander made sure she had access to specialists, physical therapy, and proper nutrition. But he didn't throw money at her. He listened. He let her have control over her recovery. He treated her not like a charity case, but like a peer, someone worthy of dignity and agency. One evening, as they all sat together at his kitchen table, Sophie coloring in her new sketchbook, Emily sipping tea with a blanket over her lap, Emily looked at him and asked, "Do you think this is all temporary?" Alexander looked at her carefully. "What do you mean? I mean, when you go back to your life, when the cameras die down, when Sophie's not so small anymore, do we just disappear?" He leaned forward. "You didn't appear in my life as a moment. You arrived as a truth, and I don't plan to forget that truth. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Emily didn't answer right away, but there was something in the way she relaxed slightly in her chair, in the way her shoulders dropped and her breath came more easily that told him she believed him. Maybe not fully, not yet, but enough to let hope Indiana. That night, Sophie asked if she could call him something different. "Not Mr. Alex, not sir. Can I call you my friend?" she asked as he tucked her in. He paused, then smiled. "That would be an honor." And in the quiet, just before she closed her eyes, she whispered, "You feel like family." He stood in the doorway long after she fell asleep, hand resting on the frame, heart heavy with something he'd never quite felt before. Not burden, not responsibility, something deeper, something like belonging. As autumn settled over the city, the days grew shorter and the winds colder. But inside Alexander's world, something unfamiliar had begun to blossom. Comfort. Life had become something textured, unpredictable, and unexpectedly beautiful. Mornings were no longer dictated by stock alerts and boardroom briefings. Instead, they began with a soft patter of Sophie's feet on the hardwood floor, her yawns echoing through the hall as she trudged sleepily into the kitchen where Alexander had already begun to burn the toast or undercook the eggs. She never complained. She giggled. She offered to help, and together they created breakfasts that would never win awards, but always filled the room with warmth. Emily, still healing but regaining her strength rapidly, had moved into a nearby apartment arranged by Alexander's legal team. She insisted on paying what she could, and though the number was symbolic at best, Alexander accepted it without hesitation. He respected her determination to build again, to work to provide for her daughter even when she had nothing. He offered her a part-time position in the community outreach division of his company, helping to redesign patient intake programs for lower-income families. Her experience, her voice, became the soul of a reform campaign that was changing how healthcare was distributed across their city. One crisp Saturday, Alexander took Sophie and Emily to the park, a quiet place just beyond the city's noise, where trees wore coats of gold and red, and children chased each other across the grass. It wasn't the kind of place he would have gone before, but now it felt like the only place he wanted to be. Sophie wore her new jacket, one with glittery stars on the sleeves, and clutched a paper kite they had bought from a street vendor. The string tangled easily, and the kite refused to lift, but she laughed anyway. She looked so free, so alive in that moment that Alexander found himself blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. Emily sat beside him on the bench, watching her daughter run. She looked healthier now, her cheeks no longer hollow, her voice no longer weak. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was full of unspoken gratitude and something even deeper, a recognition of each other's survival. "Do you ever think about what your life was before all this?" she asked after a long pause. Alexander considered the question. "I used to think I had everything, success, power, respect. But now I think I was just very good at building walls, so I didn't have to notice how empty it all was." Emily nodded. "I used to believe that survival meant pretending everything was fine. That if I didn't ask for help, no one could take anything away from me. But it still gets taken," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "But now I understand. It's okay to need people." Sophie ran back to them, her face flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. "It flew," she cried, It only stayed up for like 5 seconds, but it flew. Alexander opened his arms, and she dove into his hug without hesitation. He lifted her into his lap, wrapping his coat around her tiny frame. She leaned into him, her breath fogging up the buttons of his jacket. Emily reached over and tucked a strand of Sophie's hair behind her ear. For a brief moment they sat there as something resembling a family. Not perfect, not traditional, but whole, in a way none of them had known they could be. Later that evening, back at Alexander's apartment, Sophie fell asleep on the couch with a blanket over her and a book resting open on her chest. Emily stood in the kitchen sipping tea while Alexander cleaned up the remnants of their impromptu pasta dinner. She watched him work, still somewhat amazed at how easily he had slipped into this version of himself. "I don't know if you realize how rare this is," she said softly. He looked up. "What is you all of this?" Most people wouldn't have stopped that day at the hospital. They definitely wouldn't have changed their lives because of it. Alexander put down the dish towel and leaned against the counter. "Maybe I didn't change my life. Maybe I finally found it." The words hung between them raw and unexpected. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked down at the cup in her hands, then back up at him. "Sophie thinks the world of you. She believes you can do anything." "I don't want to let her down," he said. "Then don't," she said gently. "But don't be afraid to let her see you're human. She doesn't need perfect. She just needs real." That night, Alexander sat beside Sophie until she stirred awake and let him carry her to bed. She didn't say much, just clung to him sleepily, whispering, "I'm glad you're here." He turned off the light and stood at the door, watching her for a long moment before stepping into the hallway. As he walked past the windows and saw the city stretching out beyond the glass, glittering and indifferent, he realized something had shifted in him completely. He no longer wanted to live above the world. He wanted to be inside it with messy mornings and tangled kites and second-hand storybooks that made a little girl fall asleep with a smile on her face. This wasn't just healing. This was rebirth. And for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't chasing what was next. He was finally living what was now. Winter arrived quietly without the usual chaos of holidays or the rush of corporate year-end reports. For Alexander, the season brought with it a stillness that felt both unfamiliar and deeply necessary. Snow began to collect along the edges of the sidewalks and rooftops, blanketing the city in a kind of softness that mirrored the internal changes he had spent months navigating. His once constant schedule of meetings and business travel had narrowed to just the essentials. The boardroom had lost its pull. It wasn't that he didn't care about his company anymore. It was that he had finally realized the kind of legacy he wanted had nothing to do with quarterly earnings and everything to do with human impact. By then, Emily had grown strong enough to begin working full-time. She spent her days helping underserved patients navigate a new program Alexander had established, the Carter Access Initiative. Her job was more than a paycheck. It was a mission. Her voice, her story, and her persistence were reshaping how the company interacted with people who had once been ignored or dismissed. And she was good at it. People listened to her. They trusted her. Alexander watched this evolution with quiet pride, though he never claimed credit for her strength. He knew she'd always had it. All he had done was finally give her space to use it. Sophie was thriving too. Her teachers called regularly now, but not to report issues. Instead, they praised her growing confidence, her storytelling skills, and the way she had begun to make friends. She was still cautious, still kept pieces of herself protected, but she laughed more. She argued playfully about which cereal to buy. She insisted on decorating a small tree in Alexander's apartment with handmade ornaments, each one more glittery and crooked than the last. She even asked if they could make cookies. And though he burned the first batch completely, she had insisted they tasted amazing because they were made with heart, not instructions. One evening, close to Christmas, Alexander surprised Sophie with a small wrapped box. Inside was a key on a delicate chain. She stared at it for a moment before asking what it was for. "It's a spare key," he explained, "to this place. I know it's not your only home, but I want you to know it's yours too whenever you want it to be." She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stood up, wrapped her arms around his waist, and buried her face in his chest. She didn't cry, and neither did he. But something inside both of them settled like a book finally finding its shelf. The next few days were a blur of snowflakes, meetings, hot chocolate, and quiet joy. They didn't throw parties. There were no extravagant gifts or over-the-top decorations. Just warmth, laughter, nights spent watching movies on the couch. Mornings where Sophie snuck into the kitchen to try making pancakes before anyone else woke up. Emily joined them often, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Their time together became effortless, no longer dictated by necessity or obligation, but chosen, cherished. Then just after the New Year, something happened that changed everything once again, but this time not with fear, not with crisis, but with unexpected grace. Alexander received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a short note and an old photograph. The note read, "I saw what you did. I was wrong about you. Thank you." The photograph showed a young woman, frail and smiling, holding a newborn baby. The same baby, who was now a 7-year-old girl, sleeping peacefully in the next room. It was Emily, Sophie, and someone else. A young man whose face Alexander had never seen before, but who bore a striking resemblance to Sophie. He showed it to Emily later that evening. She went quiet, staring at it for a long time. "That's her father," she said finally. He left before Sophie could talk. "I never thought we'd hear from him again." "Do you think he sent this?" Alexander asked gently. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't matter because he didn't come back." "And you did?" Alexander wasn't sure what to say to that. There was no script for this kind of family. No rule book, just instinct. He reached out, took her hand, and they sat in silence. Weeks passed. Emily continued to grow in her role at the company. Sophie entered a school art contest and won second place for a drawing titled "My Brave Day," a picture of a tiny girl behind the wheel of a huge car with hospital lights in the background. She stood beside her sketch at the exhibit, proudly explaining it to strangers while Alexander and Emily watched from a distance, overwhelmed by the courage in that little body. That night, back at the apartment, as they all had dinner together, Sophie suddenly looked up from her plate and asked, "Can people have more than one family?" Alexander glanced at Emily, and she gave him the space to answer. "Yes," he said. "Family isn't just who you're born to. It's who you hold on to when things get hard. It's the people who stay." Sophie seemed to accept that. She went back to her food, humming a little as she chewed, but Emily didn't look away. Her eyes stayed on Alexander for a long time, and there was something different in them now. Not just gratitude or trust, but something more complicated and real. A recognition of what they had built, of what it meant. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, and the apartment had grown quiet, Alexander stood alone in the living room, watching the snowfall beyond the glass. He thought about how much had changed in such a short time. He thought about how easily he could have missed it all if he'd looked away that one day outside the hospital. And he knew now some people came into your life like fire, burning everything you thought you needed. And in their place they planted something deeper, something that would last. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet, almost reverent warmth. The frost melted slowly from the edges of sidewalks. Trees budded in soft green, and the air carried a faint sweetness that hinted at beginnings. For Alexander, it marked a year since the day everything had changed. The day he walked out of the hospital and saw a little girl gripping the steering wheel of a battered car, her eyes wide with fear but her hands steady with resolve. That image had never left him. It had rooted itself into the foundation of who he now was, shaping his choices, his relationships, even his vision for the future. Life had grown into something textured and full. Not perfect, there were still questions, still nights when Emily woke from dreams she didn't want to explain, and days when Sophie withdrew into quiet spells of sadness. But those moments were met with patience, not panic. They were met with family. Sophie was thriving in school. reading above her grade level, experimenting with painting, and carrying herself with a calmness rare for her age. Her teacher said she was a natural leader, though still guarded, like someone who had learned too early how quickly safety could vanish. She talked about feelings now, sometimes in bursts, sometimes in whispers, but always honestly. Alexander learned to listen without trying to fix everything, and that was the greatest lesson she had taught him. Emily's work had expanded beyond the hospital system. She began speaking at conferences, writing essays, advocating for health care access across the country. Her words weren't polished, but they were raw and true. And that made them powerful. People listened. Policies began to shift. What had started as a job had become a mission she carried in her bones. She still spent her evenings with Sophie, helping with homework, cooking dinner, sometimes just sitting on the couch watching old cartoons. Her days were filled with action, but her nights were filled with presence. She didn't try to rebuild the past. She simply lived forward. And Alexander, he had done something few men like him ever dared to do. He had stepped back from his empire, not to abandon it, but to give it room to evolve. He promoted new leadership, empowered the right voices, and built systems that didn't rely solely on him. He was still respected, still recognized in public, still invited to events where cameras waited, but he no longer craved any of it. What mattered most to him now was not what the world saw, but what he came home to each evening. Sophie asleep on the couch with her books slid to the floor, and Emily humming softly in the kitchen, pouring tea into two mismatched mugs. One Saturday in late April, Sophie came home from school with a project, write about someone who changed your life. She asked if she could write about both her mom and Mr. Alex. Emily helped her with the structure, but the words were entirely her own. She wrote about the hospital, about driving the car, about being afraid, but doing it anyway. She wrote about how her mom always knew how to make her feel brave, and how Mr. Alex always made her feel safe. She ended the essay with a line that Emily couldn't read without crying. I think family is the people who show up and never stop showing up. When Alexander read it, he didn't speak. He just closed the pages gently and pulled Sophie into a long, silent hug. No praise, no advice, just presence. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. The city awarded Sophie a bravery medal in a quiet ceremony at City Hall. It wasn't televised or extravagant, but it was deeply meaningful. She stood on the small stage wearing a pale blue dress and the necklace Alexander had given her with the spare key, and accepted the medal with a shy smile. When asked if she wanted to say something, she stepped forward and said, I didn't feel brave that day. I just did what I had to do. My mom was hurt and no one was coming, so I came instead. Then she paused and added, but I wasn't alone. I just didn't know it yet. Afterward, they went out for dinner. Just the three of them, no speeches, no photographs, just burgers and milkshakes at a quiet diner, where no one asked for autographs or snapped pictures through windows. It was Sophie who made the toast. She raised her glass of chocolate milk and declared, to found families, and to the people who keep choosing you. Alexander clinkered his glass gently to hers, and so did Emily. In that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. One evening, as spring leaned into summer, Emily and Alexander sat together on the rooftop of his building, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Sophie had fallen asleep hours earlier, curled up with a book she could barely keep open. They hadn't planned to talk, but the silence felt like an invitation neither of them wanted to ignore. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen her that day? Emily asked all the time, he admitted. And it scares me. She nodded. Me too, but I did see her, he said. And she saw me. And nothing's been the same since. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. Thank God for that. There were no grand declarations between them that night. No promises or confessions. Just a closeness that spoke for itself, made stronger by everything they had walked through together. They had all survived something. And more than that, they had all chosen something better in its aftermath. Not because they had to, but because they could. And sometimes that choice quiet unwavering and made every single day was the most extraordinary kind of love.